You have a bishop in Rome named Jerome. And Jerome is actually from Africa. He is sent to translate the Bible into Latin. And so he travels to Jerusalem, spends 3 years in Jerusalem, teaching himself. Latin Vulgate has survived. The church that only scholars should read, and Wycliffe worked hard to try to create a Bible. He ended up being burned at the stake because of it. I think we have a picture up there of William Tyndale. And he made a translation in 1526, and his translation is powerful in its influence in the English language. Now, I've not studied this myself, but they say 75% of the King James Version is based very closely on this Wycliffe translation. If you have an English Standard, which is a revision of the Revised Standard Version, about 65% of it has its root in Wycliffe's work, and that goes all the way back to 1526. Now, a lot of people didn't like Wycliffe doing it, and in fact, a bishop came to him and told him that he was profaning the Word of God because only scholars, only experts should be able to study God's Word. Common people had messed it up. And his famous phrase is, if God allows me to live long enough, I'm going to make it where the plowboy knows more scripture than the Pope. And his idea was he was wanting to bring down the Bible to the common man, to the point to where the common man could preach and know doctrine just as well as somebody in seminary, just as well as somebody in Rome, just as well as somebody who is an official in church. And that's our goal today, especially in our fellowship. We want to go back to the Bible, and we want to be able to, every one of us, to be able to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, and do it so with the spirit of meekness and gentleness. But every one of us needs to be able to explain why we believe what we believe. And so that is the background of why you want an English translation, why you want a translation that you can read and that you can understand. Of course, we go through a lot of stuff. Coverdale, the Matthew Bible, the Good Bible. These came from King James VIII. The Douze Reims was a Catholic version. It came out with Queen Mary. And eventually King James wasn't really a religious kind of guy. He kind of had lifestyles in 2 or 3 different aspects of his life that we would not agree with. But he authorized a translation to be made. Well, why would he authorize a translation to be made if he's not a very necessarily religious person? Well, if you look at the English monarchy, when the Catholics were in charge, they insisted on their Bible. And when the Protestants were in charge, they insisted on their Bible. And England had gone through many, many wars over religion. And so he tried to create a Bible that was a compromise, a Bible that was not Catholic, a Bible that was not Protestant, a Bible that did not have any footnotes or any side notes. It was just Bible. And as you read through that Bible, you're going to find, and it's brought to many of our newer translations as well, some compromises which are there. Instead of baptisto, instead of it being immersion, we've transliterated it to baptism. You look in Acts, I think it's 12:4, if I'm not mistaken. Instead of it being the Sabbath, it's going to be Easter. And there's a few spots there where you see those compromises being made, where James is making sure that he can rule one country, and even after his time, that country is going to remain unified. And the King James translation, through Shakespeare and through many of the poets and many other people, it has unified the English world for 4 or 5 centuries. It has been one of those things, it's just a catalyst. If you're an Englishman, or if you have a heritage going back to England, you have a special place in your heart for the King James Bible. And so some of those words that are in there that you wouldn't know from anywhere else, you know because that is the standard. And that's a standard that many of us grew up with, and a standard that many of us know. And so that's kind of an interesting quick history, if you will, of some of this stuff as it goes on, and some of the stuff that's done here. Now, let's talk about translations. And the question is, why? Why do you have to have a translation? And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a bit, but you always have your question. And the question is, do you educate people up to where they can understand the Word of God, or do you bring the Word of God and make it simplistic enough where the common man does not have to be educated in order to read it? In a perfect world, Every single person on this earth would be taught Koine Greek. That's what the type of Greek that the Bible is written in. And then in our spare time, we would all learn biblical Hebrew. 3 of those languages, you would not need a translation. You're good. Boom. Good to go. The problem with that, and I'm not the quickest dude in the world, the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree. I've had 4 semesters of Greek in undergrad and 3 semesters of Greek in my graduate school. I still can't speak the stuff. It still takes me a while to work my way through it. And when I was in college, we would translate different books and such. And I've got to admit, if you are taking a Greek test, just memorize the American Standard and it helps you pretty good. But it took a lot of work to get through there. And so we can't make you needing a college degree, a doctorate degree in biblical languages, be the gateway to get to heaven. That's just not reasonable for any of us. And the measure of if someone knows Greek is ask them. If they say yes, that means they don't. Because it's a very difficult language. And so that's the deal that's going on there of why we need translations. Well, look at 3 reasons right here. First of all, why do you need translations? Well, languages are different. How many of you in high school or college ever had to take a different language class? Okay, good number of people. And usually for us, it's something fairly easy, Spanish, German, French, something that's kind of on our line or branch of what you want. I grew up in Odessa, Texas. Over half of them were Hispanic, and the only thing I can say in Spanish is number 2 with extra queso. We're not great at languages, but the more you study languages, you're going to find out they're different. Back and forth. German has the verb at the very end. And so you have your noun, your predicate, and then you have to wait forever to figure out what you're doing with your noun and predicate because the verb's at the very end. Spanish is mixed up sometimes over that way as well. English, if you're ESL, if you're not a native English speaker, it's a tough language to go through. Languages are different. And so as you and I look at this, we'll find out our languages are different as well. And so the Hebrew language only has 24 consonants. And if you look at the way it's written in the Bible, there's no vowels. You just kind of stick your vowel where you want it to be. And so it's a very difficult language to learn if you're not really studied in it, if you haven't really spent a lot of time. And even people in Israel today have a little bit of trouble with biblical Hebrew. The same way with Greek. Greek is very different. And so you have to train and do these sort of things. And beyond that, the language is different. Koine Greek, which the New Testament's written in, it's common man Greek, Koine, common, is a lot more specific or a lot more descriptive. You and I would say, I'm in love. Okay? Now, the Greek would say, and I'm just using this illustration because we know it because we've been in church forever, agapeo, or agape as we like to say, or storge, or phileo, or eros. You go through, there's 6 different words for love. According to C.S. Lewis, there's 5 words for love. And so it's a lot more descriptive. And so in order to fully understand that, you've got to bring it into a language that we can understand. And so one word doesn't always easily translate to another. And so that's why you have to have a translation. Now, languages change. Languages change. You don't hear people walk around anymore saying groovy, right? Unless they're just old, right? Okay. Groovy, far out. Now, I may be speaking your love language there. Groovy, far out, cool. My kids say cap and no cap and riz. Okay. You ever hear that? I have no idea what any of that means, so if I cussed, forgive me. I didn't cuss, but I just know I can say those words when I'm teaching school and everybody stops and looks at me. That's how I get their attention. Just start talking that way. Well, those words mean something to somebody. I don't know what it means because our language is always changing. Our state song, Kentucky State song, talks about how the children are all gay, right? That means something different. Well, we're all gay, it says. That means something different today than it meant when that song was written, right?
because the words change meaning. And our language is alive, it's fluid, and so words always have different meanings as you come through, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit as we get down there and talk about some of these words. There's idioms, and the idioms that don't make sense to us unless they're translated. Dan to Beersheba. Well, what does that mean? It's talking about north to south, it's the entire country. Another idiom that I just love, 1 John 3:17, have bowels of compassion one for another. Now that they have translated that, but it more or less means have a stomach ache where you need to go to the restroom for one another. That's not what you want to hear your spouse say to you before you go to bed, right? But what that meant back in that time, they didn't talk about emotions, they talked about body things. And so when they said, I've got bowels of emotion, that meant I have butterflies in my stomach when I think of you. I'm lightheaded because of my love for you is so great. But unless you recognize that idiom, you got some problems and issues which are there. And so Acts 2 and Acts 7, the people are cut to the heart. What's that mean? With their conscience has been touched. Their conscience has been moved. And so the languages are there. And also, you got to know that translations have agendas. Now, that sounds terrible to say in that way, but there's two main theories or agendas for translation. One is called the static. That is word for word. You see a word here, and it's going to be right there. It's almost like we're saying, okay, this is the word in Greek, that's the word in English. This is the word in Hebrew, that's the word in English. And that's that word for word idea. The problem with that is when you make that into an English translation, it's hard to read. We'll look at an illustration of that here in just a second. Secondly, in fact, let's go ahead and hop over there. Secondly, you have your form or your dynamic idea of translation, where you say, okay, this is what he said, this is what he meant. All right, he said this, but this doesn't make sense, but I'm going to translate it where this finally makes sense to you and works out in a pretty good way. This is a very simple idea here. It's Psalm 23. Remember, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside the still waters. All right. So if you train everybody up to study Hebrew, we would just do that first line. And you'd read that first line, that's Psalm 23. You got it made. Now, if you got an actual interlinear or just put this word right here, exactly what it means, we would read it straight saying, I don't want, the Lord is my shepherd, a Psalm of David. That's because it's written backwards, isn't it? And so you go through that, that makes very little sense. Now, since I've heard Psalm 23:1, and since I've memorized Psalm 23:1, when I read the transliteration, I'm like, yeah, okay, I get what's going on here. I see that Hebrew's written in a backwards way, and that sounds like what I'm used to, so I'm a little bit comfortable. Formal equivalent, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's what you'll have in your King James or your American Standard. Dynamic equivalents, and this is from the TEV, today's English version. The Lord is my shepherd, and I have all I need. You see how they've changed that? Instead of I shall not want, that might not make sense unless you've heard it in church a lot of times. God's given me everything I need. That in a sense, in that man's eyes, has made a little bit more sense in what we see and what we like. And so the question is, do you want a formal equivalence, a word for word? Do you want a dynamic equivalent? We don't want a literal because that would be impossible to understand if you're sitting there reading in church or reading at home. And so the question is, which one do you want? Which one works well for whatever it is that you are going through? Sorry. All right. So as you go through here, formal equivalence, the desire is to, let's go ahead and go to our next slide. Formal equivalence, the desire is to preserve the original as much as possible. God, the official, has said this, and I'm going to say it in the exact same way. There's a word for a preacher or evangelist called kerusso, Kerusso. Kevin knows what Caruso means. It's somebody who travels from city to city and has to repeat the words of the king. The king would tell a person what to say, and that person would go to Possum Trot, that person would go to Olive, that person would go to Hardin, and I'm pointing in every direction because I'm not sure which way I'm facing because I'm in the gym. But they would go there and they have to repeat word for word whatever they've heard. That's the idea that we're trying to do with that static, with that word for word translation. The king has said this, we're going to say it exactly as well. Your problem with that is it's wooden, it's hard to read. If you're sitting around a table one night and you begin reading your American Standard Translation, you're going to read about a chapter or two and you're going to be worn out. Because it works your brain a little bit. You can stay home and you can read a chapter or two of the King James, and you grew up with the King James, so that helps. But it's still a little bit tough when you work your way through and learning about, and when you're just doing your daily Bible reading. Now, the word for word translation is good when you're doing a Bible study. When you're studying with somebody and you need to be able to compare doctrine, what it is God has said, and you want to know what God has said about salvation, about worship, or whatever else it might be. In a generation ago, we had Strong's Concordance, Thayer's English Lexicon. You remember those books? They're not around as much because we have Google now. Each one of those is keyed to the King James. And the reason for that is it tends to be more word for word, not completely. 1 Corinthians 13, for some inexplicable reason, it goes from love to charity. It's the same Greek word, but different people translated it before 1 Corinthians 13 and after 1 Corinthians 13. But for the most part, it's word for word as you go through. And so if you're doing a word study, if you're studying the Bible with somebody, if you're studying a subject and you want to know precisely what the Bible teaches, that word for word, that static translation is where you want to be. That is your best spot to go. Now, on your other side is your dynamic. And I think it's here called thought for thought, or formal equivalence, or dynamic equivalence would be another way to put it. And that is where they desire to communicate what's said. And so you hear from somebody, and the guy turns around and says, okay, that's what he said. This is what he means. This is the direction that he's going in. And so a translation like that, you can sit down and read it, and it'll read just like a novel. It's not going to mess with your brain because it's written just in a way in which you're used to going through and reading it. And so it makes it a lot easier if you're doing devotional study, if you're going through a year of this Bible and going through things like that. And so that side is a little bit easier, and it also makes a little bit more sense. But you got to be careful because the translator who's doing this has made a lot of decisions. He's decided that he knows what God is saying and he knows how to make it plain to you. And so you need to know who the guy is that's translating this. You need to know why he's saying some of the things that he's saying and what his purpose is and what he thinks is important as he goes through all of these things that are here. And so when you run through and you begin looking at that, again, your word for word, you might not be able to see up there exactly what it is, but what we're talking about is maybe your New American Standard, maybe your English Standard, which is a revision of the Revised Standard Version. It's got a lot of corrections of the Revised Standard. Your Holman Christian Study Bible, CSB, I think is what they call it. They used to call it a Holman Bible back when Lifeway was doing its thing. And the King James, to a certain extent. Those are your word for words. And those are where you're trying to be exact with something. That's where you go, yeah, what you got, Matt?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Out of your word for word,
Uh-huh.
all of those, generally speaking, which would be considered the most accurate?
Okay, the question is, out of the word for word, which is the most accurate? Okay. All right. If you're looking for word, and my Bible scholars can correct me if you want, I think the Old American Standard or New American Standard would be it, and a close second would be your English Standard. Your English Standard is going to have some weaknesses in Psalm 61 And it's going to have some weaknesses in Romans 1 and some weaknesses in 1 Timothy 2. But I don't want to get into that yet. But there's some spots where you're like, whoo, what in the world are you doing? But I think that's the most exact. Is that what you think? Is that about right? Close? Lonnie, you good with that? Yeah. When I'm in grad school taking a Greek test and doing Greek homework, not that I would ever cheat, but if you're reading something, you're like, man, I don't know about that. The translation I look it up is New American Standard. Now, I ran into trouble because Dow Flack called me in one day and said, how did you know to translate it that way? Because he knew I'd looked at the New American Standard. But that's the most exact, I think, that you would do. And so, but when you have your English Standard and your American Standard, it's hard to read. It's kind of wooden. You can tell it's a translation. It's not the native language that's there. Now, as we keep going, your dynamic is you're easier to understand stuff. And this will be a little bit of the NIV. NIV is not totally in the dynamic. It's kind of there in the middle. But your New Living Translation, some of that, which is going on. And actually, I think sometimes these are good to read in a devotional aspect. Generally, I read the Bible a couple times every year, and I don't say that to brag because I better be reading the Bible more than most people because, it's my job, right? And so, it's one of those things where somebody says, how do you quote so many scriptures? And I'm like, it's what I do for a living. It's one of those things where you have to study these things. And many times I will choose a dynamic equivalence and I'll read it through the year. And it's weird because you'll run across something that's worded totally different. And then you have to stop and say, well, why would they word that different? Is there a doctrinal thing they're shooting for? Is there something different in the syntax of the Greek that they're shooting for? And that's one of those things that you can see. Now, you got your paraphrase, and your paraphrase is going to be like your message, your expanded Bible, any of your children's Bible, NIRV. I think we use for some of our children's classes. And be really careful about these because what this is it's just like somebody telling you a Bible story in Sunday school. If your teacher's standing up there and they tell you about Jesus and Zacchaeus, that's pretty much what a paraphrase is. They're just telling you the story. And, they're kind of close, but they're kind of just going off in their own way and adding whatever they need. Now, when you're looking through your translations, watch for the religious agenda. The New World Translation, that's translation Jehovah's Witnesses use. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. That's John 1:1 in New World Translation. What in the world? No other translation says the Word was a God. So, and there's no Greek background to say that, but their denomination, their Christian sect, their Christian group there needs their Bible to say that so they can teach what they want to teach. And so that you read the New World Translation, you're going to see Jehovah's Witness doctrine. They just went over and put their doctrine in there and told their members, you got to read this to try to strengthen what they already believe, which is not quite correct, at least in my view. And so you have some of those. Holman Bible or Christian Standard Bible. It's created by Lifeway. It's created by the Baptist Church. And so there's going to be that agenda, which is there. Now, it's a very good translation. And it's a very strong translation. And there's nothing in the world wrong with using it. But just know some of the backgrounds there. And then, of course, like everything, money has messed it up. And you print Bibles to make money. All these companies, Zondervan and Nelson and everybody, they're printing Bibles to make money. And so that's why you have your athlete's Bible, and that's why you have your woman's Bible, and that's why you have your soldier's Bible, and that's why you have your hunter's Bible, and that's why you have your preacher's Bible, and whatever else it may be that day. There's a lot of them out there. Well, those Bibles are kind of slanted. I wouldn't say they change the scriptures much to match this or that, but they're slanted for that reason when you go through there. But the graph that's on the back of your sheets, that's from Zondervan. So if you just go to Zondervan, zondervan.com, Of course, they're trying to sell you their Bibles. And so you'll notice their Bibles are a little bit closer to the word for word than some of the others. But that's the Zondervan graph, which they have used since the 80s, they've used since the early 2000s. The one that we have up here, it's from another Bible company. It's from Nelson. And so, of course, Nelson throws Zondervan one way or the other, whichever way they think will sell their Bibles better. But for a general purpose, this is a pretty good scale to show you where all these guys are hanging out and what all these guys are doing with what they're doing. All right. Now, be careful. When you think you have the perfect translation and you start looking down your nose at everybody else, be careful, because every translation leads you to God, but not every translation is perfect. And if you look closely enough at any translation, you're going to find issues which are there. And now some of them you have to look a little harder, some of them not so much. King James has been the standard forever, but it's hard to understand. 1 Corinthians 13:4. Let me think. Charity vaunteth not itself. All right, if you got a teenager down here and you said, charity vaunteth not itself, what did I just say? They would say, there's some girl on the track team and she's bad at pole vaulting. You know, they'd have trouble understanding exactly what charity vaunteth not itself means. I took some kids to a youth rally back many, many years ago, and a guy was from a preaching school, and he preached for 45 minutes on James 1:21, the superfluity of naughtiness. And we listened to 45 minutes of the superfluity of naughtiness. And we got in the bus on the way back, and I asked the kids what the lesson was about. They had no idea. Now, other translations talk about the overflow of wickedness in the heart. It's a little bit more easy to understand, right? And there are places in the King James where you can find a touch of Calvinism. And there are places where you can find some things. Acts 2:47, should be saved instead of be saved. There's that touch, which is there, a little bit of some of the compromises which were made. Unicorn is found in the New King James 9 times because that was a national animal of England. And so they'd run across goat every once in a while, and if it was in a random place and they thought no one would care, they stuck in unicorn. It's just things like that. NIV. You've been in church long enough to hear some good NIV sermons, right? You go through Romans 5, the word sarx is translated sinful nature. We don't have a sinful nature, but we have a propensity to sin. And it's mistranslated in that way. Psalm 51, I was born in iniquity. There's some weak ones there. So, Matt asked what's the most accurate Bible. What's my favorite Bible? And this is kind of a joke, but kind of not. The red one. I'm not talking about R-E-D, I'm talking about R-E-A-D. Okay, R-E-A-D, the red one. I've heard a lot of sermons talking about don't read this translation because there's this verse here or verse there. Man, if the congregation is reading that Bible closely enough to find that one verse, that's good. Because too many of us are so busy, we're not reading our whole Bibles. And so find a translation that you can work with. Find a translation that you can make it through and read it. And read it enough and know its weaknesses, know its background, and know what it is that you're working with. All right, so 3 considerations and then we're done. 900 translations. You can go to BibleGateway.com. You can go to Bible.com. You can go to Logos. Logos is still in business. And you can find all sorts of stuff, a lot of it free on the internet. You can go to Sam's or Walmart, or if you find a Bible bookstore somewhere, there's not many of them like there used to be, you can find a lot of Bibles. You can, Christian book dealers, you can, CBD.com, it's not for marijuana, it's for Bible books. Christian book dealers, you can buy Bibles for much cheaper than you can anywhere else. There are so many resources. But take advantage. Of all the times for you to be alive, this is one of the best times. Not only do we have air conditioning, we've got all sorts of good Bible study stuff that you can have. And it's equivalent, a lot of it, if you will put yourself into it, to what somebody who went to college and got a Bible degree would have learned and would have known. And so take advantage of these resources. Number 2, if it's a study that needs to be exact, look for your formal word-for-word equivalent. If you're studying with somebody about how to be a Christian, if you're talking about a point of doctrine, that's probably your safer place. If it's for devotional reading and you're looking for something that just doesn't scramble your brain, then you can go in that other way. It's okay to do the dynamic equivalent and go in that direction. But whatever translation you find, study it. And when you study it, you're not just looking at the verses. Read those first few pages of why the King James is called the Authorized Version, of who it was that contributed to your translation, of the background of some of these people and why they chose what they chose. Most translations today will have about 5 or 10 pages of the people saying, this is why we did it this way, and this is why we wanted a new translation. Peruse that, study through that, and kind of have an idea of what kind of translation you have and what some of its strengths are and some of its weaknesses as well. Now, for many, many years, we really, in churches, have said you need to use one translation, or if you use this translation, you're safe. If you use this translation, you're in great danger. I don't preach that very much. There are some translations that are goofy, but find a good translation and know what's behind it. And just about any translation, especially word-for-word translations, will tell you enough about Jesus to where you can make it to heaven pretty easy if you obey it. But that's what you need to work on, and that's how you need to go.